Okay, now let's talk about Lamarck. And to do that, I'm going to start showing you a video. And then I will focus on the key points of that video.
Lamarck is often portrayed as someone who anticipated the phenomenon of evolution, gave Darwin the idea, so to speak, but muddled the mechanism. As we'll see, that's a pretty significant distortion. In most textbooks of evolution, Lamarck is credited with a wrong-headed idea of heredity. This is usually labeled as the inheritance of acquired characters. Let's illustrate this with a well-known caricature of the idea. A blacksmith works all his life and develops massive muscles in his right arm. If this character acquired during the blacksmith's life was inherited, Lamarck would say that his sons should therefore be born with muscular right arms. At this point, everyone usually has a good laugh. Stupid Lamarck. And then there's the story of the long neck of the giraffe. Lamarck would say, we are told, that giraffes have long necks because their short-necked ancestors were always reaching for the high leaves on trees, and this made their necks grow as they stretched. Their offspring would then have slightly longer necks than usual, and as they stretched their necks, their offspring would have longer necks still. Over time, the long-necked giraffe evolves. This is sounding like one of Kipling's Just So stories. Again, quite comical. Lamarck's evolutionary thinking was actually much more sophisticated than this. If we're to understand Lamarck properly, and Darwinism properly for that matter, we have to know what Lamarck actually thought, rather than what his detractors might want us to think. First, we need to know something about Lamarck and his times. Lamarck, the young man, was a war hero in one of France's wars with Prussia, and as a reward was granted a royal pension, which allowed him to study natural history, which he had always loved. Ultimately, this landed him a position as caretaker of the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris. His official title there was Curator of Worms. When the French Revolution came, he managed to keep both his position and his head, quite a feat for those tumultuous times. Lamarck was an original and creative thinker, but this needs to be put into the context of his times. For example, oxygen had only been recently discovered. Most scientists still believed in phlogiston. There was little knowledge of living chemistry, of heredity, of genes, and of how embryonic development worked. Lamarck, like nearly all his contemporaries, had what we now call an essentialist view of life. By this, we mean that living things were thought to be animated by a special kind of vital stuff, vis essentialis they called it, that organized dead matter into living organisms through various kinds of vital forces. These vital forces were thought to explain two major problems in biology. The first was how living things, in all their complexity, managed to grow from formless dead matter. Just think of the development of a living chick from the formless blob of a freshly laid egg. The second was how living things could adapt to changing circumstances. How, for example, did the blacksmith's arm know to build muscle when it was worked? How did a bird's body know to put on extra plumage and fat when the weather got cold? To Lamarck and others, these phenomena could be accounted for by two vital forces. The first was the so-called complexifying force, le pouvoir de la vie, which drove the organization of living matter into ever more complex forms. Embryonic development, growth, and maturity were the outcome of the complexifying force molding the body. Death resulted from the loss of this force. The other was the adaptive force. I won't even try to pronounce the French. This caused vitally organized matter to remodel itself according to the demands of changing circumstances. The adaptive force is what drove the blacksmith's arm to bulk up as it was worked harder. When the adaptive force failed, disease followed. Among Lamarck's contemporaries, nearly all agreed that these forces operated within individuals. Today, we might say the science was settled. So these forces weren't a particularly original idea of Lamarck's. What did make him original, though, was his proposal that these forces could operate to shape the evolution of lineages of organisms as well as individuals. Thus, if we followed the evolution of a lineage of, say, worms, which Lamarck knew well, one should see an ever-increasing complexity in the species with time. And as the world's environment changed over long periods of time, which by Lamarck's time it was known that it did, then one should see adaptive change in a lineage so that its body form tracked the changes in the world in which the lineage lived. In short, Lamarck proposed the first operational theory for how evolution actually worked. And what he proposed was actually quite profound and far from the popular caricature of simply being the inheritance of acquired characters. He proposed that there was a fundamental similarity between organismal development and evolutionary change.